Dear learners, welcome you all again is this Swayam MOOC course on environmental politics,
Theories, concepts, and debates.
week 5, lecture 4 on challenges faced by the pressure groups and green parties, in which we are going to cover balancing environmental goals with political and economic realities. Along with that, we will be covering resistance from industrialist lobbies and conservative factions, and we will also covering the internal divisions and leadership crises within the environmental movement. So let's begin, learners. These are the points which we are going to cover today. So let's begin. So first of all, the important challenge which comes in front of the green parties and pressure groups are to how to balance the environmental goals with economic and political realities. So here we can see that the balancing act between environmental advocacy by green parties and pressure groups on the one hand and political and economic realities on the other, which represent one of the most complex challenges in sustainable governance. And here, environmental groups and green political parties often push for aggressive climate action, stricter pollution controls, and conservation policies, while governments and businesses must contend with economic growth targets, employment concerns, and industrial competitiveness. So here the a kind of like contrary stand adopted by both the groups, that are the environmental groups, the green parties and the pressure groups, and the traditional political parties and the industrialist lobbies. So that's why it is creating a kind of clash between both, and that's why this issue of attaining the environmental sustainability becomes a challenge. And this tensions is particularly evident in developing nation, where the governments are more focusing on the economic development, like India, Brazil, South Africa, China, where the imperative for rapid industrialization and poverty eradication sometimes clashes with the environmental protection goals. And here political realities further complicate this balance between both the political and economic realities and the environmental goals. Elected leaders must consider voter priorities. What are the voter priorities? Especially in the developing countries, they are more focusing on the poverty eradication, employment, economic growth, employment generation, etc., which may not always align with long-term environmental objectives. And short electoral cycles incentivize politicians to favor visible, immediate economic benefits over the gradual environmental gains. And most of the time, it creates a clash between the green parties and pressure groups and the traditional political parties. And this dynamics explains why some environmental regulation face delays or dilution despite scientific consensus on their necessity. At the same time, the growing influence of environmental pressure groups through litigation, legal litigation, public campaigns like awareness campaigns or the protest, and international advocacy has forced governments and corporations to adopt green policies. For example, the National Green Tribunal in India, which has emerged as a crucial mediator, often ruling against powerful industrial interest in favor of environmental protection, as seen in cases involving illegal mining or air pollution violations. However, enforcement remains inconsistent, reflecting the ongoing struggle between the ecological imperatives and economic or political constraints. Now we will be seeing that economic considerations similarly shape the extent to which environmental goals are prioritized. While sustainability advocates that green policies can drive innovation and also create jobs in renewable energy or waste management sectors, Industries often resist due to upfront cost and competitive disadvantages. These are the two reasons. That's why most of the industrialist lobbies and industrialist corporate sectors are not coming forward to initiate in these emerging fields. This resistance is particularly strong in the sectors like manufacturing or fossil fuels. Their high dependency is there, where environmental compliance may reduce profit margins. And here government, that's why, must design policies that incentivize green transitions without causing economic disruptions. And it is what? It is a kind of challenge which is evident in the mixed success of carbon pricing mechanisms worldwide. In India, instruments like Perform, Achieve, and Trade, that is PAT, schemes attempt to balance industrial growth with energy efficiency, but their effectiveness depends on stringent monitoring, which is often lacking, because that kind of mechanism is not yet evolved by the governments to do a strict monitoring. Now we will be seeing that ultimately achieving environmental goals within political and economic constraints requires multi-stakeholder collaboration. However, as climate urgency grows, the question remains whether incremental compromises will suffice or if more radical systematic changes are needed to reconcile environmental sustainability with development imperatives. In Green parties here, Green parties and pressure groups may play a pivotal role in raising awareness and pushing boundaries, but lasting solutions demand buy-in from businesses, policymakers, and the public. Policies that align ecological benefits with economic incentives, such as subsidies for clean technology or penalties for pollution, have shown promise in bridging this divide. Now we will be discussing what kind of resistance are there from industrial lobbies and conservative factions. So here, resistance to green parties from industrial lobbies and conservative factions, these two are very important, poses a significant challenge to their efforts to implement ambitious environmental policies. And this opposition arises because green parties' agendas often threaten established economic interests, traditional values, and existing power structures. And here, industrial lobbies, particularly those tied to fossil fuels, manufacturing, and agriculture, view stringent environmental regulations as a direct risk to their profitability and market dominance. And in this regard, we can see that how the fossil fuel industry, one of the most vocal opponents of green phasing out coal, oil, and gas, and transitioning to renewable energy. In US, the oil and gas industry has funded campaigns just to undermine climate legislation and promote skepticism about climate change, and created a significant obstacles for green initiatives. Then we can be seeing that agricultural lobbies, particularly industrial agri-businesses, have opposed pesticide bans and deforestation restrictions, framing them as threats to food security and rural livelihoods, as seen in Brazil's backlash against Amazon protection policies. In the same way, conservative political factions often resist environmental reforms on ideological grounds, portraying them as incompatible with economic growth, national sovereignty, or traditional values. And here, right-wing parties in several countries have framed climate action as elitist, anti-business, or threatening to working class industries. Like in Australia, conservative politicians have weaponized climate policy debates to protect coal interest, while in Europe, some nationalist parties oppose renewable energy transitions as undermining energy independence. Now we can see that this resistance manifests through multiple channels, like intensive lobbying against environmental legislation, like we can see that in America, American Petroleum Institute, which I have already mentioned, spent over $100 million lobbying against the US climate policies, and they also lobbied with the Republicans, including efforts to kill the Clean Power Plan under the Barack Obama administration. Secondly, we can see that is about the funding of political candidates who oppose climate action, which is also very much in trend. And here we can see that Koch Industries, through its network of dark money groups, has donated millions to politicians like Senator Mitch McConnell, who consistently block climate legislations whenever it comes in the Congress. Thirdly, we can see that public relation campaigns promoting skepticism about environmental threats. And here we can see that, for example, here we can see that ExxonMobil funded misleading ads in the 1990s through front groups like the Global Climate Coalition, casting doubt on climate science despite knowledge its risk. And then we can see that legal challenges to environmental regulation, which is very important. And here we can see in America, West Virginia sued the EPA in West Virginia versus EPA 2022, leading the Supreme Court to limit the agency's power to regulate carbon emissions from power plants. So here we can see that how it is important. And lastly, we can also see the efforts to weaken or capture the regulatory agencies. And in this regard, we can see the very current example under the presidentship of Donald Trump. Fossil fuel lobbyists were appointed to key EPA roles, leading to rollbacks of methane emissions rules and car fuel efficiency standards. So these tactics show how corporations delay climate action while green movements fight back through protest, lawsuits, and policy advocacy. Now we will be seeing what kind of counter strategies are adopted by the environmental advocates. So initially we can see that building broader coalition by partnering with labor unions, health professionals, and faith groups to demonstrate wider societal support. In this regard, we can see the example that the Green New Deal network in the US unites environmental groups like Sunrise Movement, labor unions, and racial justice organizations to push for climate policies that also create jobs and addresses inequality. Then here we can see the economic reframing, which is very, very important, and that is about to reframe the traditional economic practices by highlighting job creation in renewable energy and cost saving from pollution reduction. And in this regard, we can see, for example, the Solar Works campaign in New York, which highlights that how solar energy investments create more jobs per dollar than fossil fuels, which also counters the industry's claims that climate action hurts the economic growth. And lastly, we can see the grassroots mobilization through youth climate strikes and community organizing protest campaigns, and in which very famous example is of by Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion organized mass protests like the in 2019 global climate strikes, in which around 4 million participants were there just to pressurize government to declare climate emergencies and adopting the stricter policies regarding that. Then we can see the corporate accountability, which is very important in this regard, which basically the campaigns exposing the industry's influence and greenwashing. And here we can see an example that Exxon new campaign exposed how this company concealed climate science while funding denial groups, leading to multiple state lawsuits against that company, which is very, very important and historic in this regard. Then here we can see the legal action, which may include the climate lawsuits and shareholder activism. And in this regard, we can see in Millennium Defensive versus Shell Company 2021, their Dutch activists successfully sued Shell company, which was a kind of giant corporate company, and forced the company to cut its emission by 45% by 2030, which is a landmark corporate climate liability case. And lastly, we can see the political engagement, that how through political engagement and electoral participation they advocates for policies. So here we can see as an example that the sunrise movement's electoral strategies helped elect climate focused candidates, which is very, very important, that during the elections the voters will also see that whether in the agenda of the candidate or the party climate change and environmental issues are raised as an important issue or not. So here we can see the sunrise movement's electoral strategy, which helped to elect climate focused candidates there. Now we can see that, okay, what are the internal divisions and leadership crises within the green parties and environmental pressure groups, which is actually creating a problem by themselves, because these problems are not coming from outside, but these problems are being generated themselves inside the green parties and the environmental pressure groups. So here we can see that green parties and environmental pressure groups faces external resistance, which we have already mentioned just now, from industrial lobbies and conservative faction, and they also grapple with significant internal challenges, which is very, very important, that can weaken their effectiveness. And in this regard, firstly we can see the ideological and strategic divisions. The ideological and strategic divisions regarding what? Here the green parties and environmental movements frequently experience tensions between the radical and the moderate factions. And here, for example, we can see in Germany, Green Party has faced internal debates over whether to compromise on the issues like natural gas as a transition fuel, or to maintain a hardline stance against all fossil fuels. Then secondly, we can see the leadership crises and succession struggles. And here many green movements struggle with leadership vacuums, where there is a kind of vacuum has been generated in terms of the leadership, that who will lead the movement, or conflicts over succession, that who will be the next one. So here charismatic leaders often dominate environmental organizations, but when they step down, factions may clash over who should take the charge. Without a strong unifying leadership, movements risk losing momentum. And in this regard, the global climate movement, for instance, has relied heavily on the figures like Greta Thunberg. But questions remains about who will sustain the energy of movements like Fridays for Future in the long term. In some green parties, leadership battles have led to public scandals, resignations, or even party splits. Then we can see the representation and inclusivity challenges, which is also very much important. And here environmental groups also face criticism over lack of diversity in leadership and decision making. Like once a person become leader of that party, so all the party, that party only depends on that leader. So that's why we can see there is a lack of leadership, and of course the dominance of that leader, a kind of charismatic leader on the party, and of course on the decision making process. And here many green parties and NGOs have been accused of being dominated by urban middle class activists, and they also fail to adequately represent working class communities, especially the indigenous groups or global south representatives. This has led to tensions such as indigenous activists criticize mainstream environmental NGOs for supporting conservation policies that displace local communities. Similarly, some green parties struggle to expand beyond their traditional voter base, limiting their political influence. Now we can see the next one, that is about the organizational fragmentation. And here the environmental movement is highly decentralized, with numerous groups working on overlapping issues but often competing for funding, media attention, and political influence. And this can further lead to duplication of efforts, conflicting campaigns, and also weakened collective impact. For example, here we can see that during major climate summits like Conference of Parties, hundreds of environmental NGOs attended, but their messaging and demands are not always aligned with the mainstream policies, which further reduces their negotiating power, which is very, very disappointing for them. Then we can see the burnout and activist fatigue, which is a very important and a kind of practical issue there. And here many environmental activists face high burnout rates due to the emotional toll of constant campaigning against powerful opponents with slow progress. And here grassroots movements often rely on volunteer labor, leading to fatigue and high turnover. So now, as a conclusion, we can see that for green parties and pressure groups, they must remain effective, and that's why they must rely on some of the points. To maintain their effectiveness, green parties and environmental pressure groups must pursue strategic clarity by merging their idealistic visions with pragmatic policy solution that can gain mainstream traction. They also need inclusive leadership that reflects the communities they serve, ensuring marginalized groups have meaningful representation. Just to foster inclusive leadership that represents diverse voices, then institutional resilience is very critical here, just to establish strong structures, funding models, and succession plans so movements endure beyond charismatic leaders, which is very, very important. And that's why, just to build institutional resilience to survive beyond individual leaders. Without that leader, that charismatic leaders, if a demise is there, or suppose that person is not there, even though that movement or party will survive. And lastly, we can see finally that with better coordination between different organizations prevents fragmentation, allowing unified campaigns with greater impact. Without these elements, strategic adaptability, diversity, organizational strength, and coalition building, here environmental movements risk losing relevance or being outmoded by entrenched corporate and political opposition. So that's why they emphasizes also on to improve coordination between the different factions and organizations of green movement. So these are the activity questions through which you can analyze your progress, in which there is questions like how do green parties reconcile radical environmental policies with the economic compromises required in coalition government, which is a kind of analytical questions which you people can attempt after listening whole of the lecture. Then it is about the next one is what strategies have proven most effective for environmental groups in countering well-funded opposition from fossil fuel lobbies, which I have also discussed in the lecture. Then the third one, why do environmental movements frequently experience fragmentation between moderate and radical factions, which is there within the environmental movement, within the green party. So that is also very important, which I have also discussed. And lastly, to what extent do media portrayals of climate protest as disruptive undermine public support for environmental policy gains, in which you can examine the role of media too, that how media is portraying negatively the climate protest. And these are the papers and the research papers and books which is there in the article, which may also help you as for further reading. Thank you.